I began with the version everyone knows, the version printed in guidebooks and commemorative plaques, the version that frames the Brooklyn Bridge as a triumph of engineering and civic will. Steel cables stretching across the East River, caissons sunk into bedrock, workers descending into pressurized chambers beneath the waterline. It is a story told so often that its edges have softened into certainty, nothing unexpected, nothing unaccounted for. But certainty is usually where investigation actually begins. When I started pulling municipal construction logs and contractor correspondence from the early 1880s, small irregularities surfaced almost immediately. Notes that did not quite align with final reports. Delays attributed to subsurface complications without elaboration, references to material being removed and disposed of off-site rather than catalogued. The language was careful, procedural, almost deliberately uncurious. I looked for follow-up memoranda, engineering addenda, anything that explained what those complications had been. There were none. Instead, the paper trail simply resumed, as if the interruption had resolved itself too neatly to deserve record. Crews returned to work. Supervisors signed off. Timetables corrected. The bridge advanced. What unsettled me was not what appeared in the archives, but what did not. No diagrams, no preservation requests, no external consultations, only a brief interruption in a project that otherwise documented everything with obsessive precision. Structures do not pause without reason, and when they do, that reason usually leaves marks. Somewhere beneath one of the most studied construction projects in American history, the ground had resisted. Something had required acknowledgement. Then it had been written past. The next references were harder to locate, and once found, harder to read in isolation. Buried in engineering summaries and subcontractor invoices were notations that hinted at something other than unstable soil or water intrusion. Entries marked with coordinates beneath the eastern anchorage, cartloads removed at irregular intervals, requests for additional bracing in an area that should already have been cleared to bedrock. The phrasing stayed technical, neutral, almost aggressively so. One margin note described an obstruction encountered at a depth inconsistent with natural debris for that section of riverbank. Another recorded a temporary halt while inspectors were summoned from the city offices. No names, no diagrams, only the bureaucratic outline of something that did not fit into the normal sequence of excavation. What caught my attention was the shift in tempo. Construction projects of this scale normally linger over problems in writing. Here, the delay was brief. A cluster of paperwork appeared, then vanished again into routine. Later secondary accounts filled in what the official ledgers refused to describe directly. Workmen widening a cut beneath the caisson floor, soil layers interrupted by something denser, shapes that forced picks to glance sideways rather than bite through, and then the word that appeared in only one surviving clipping, bones, not fragments, not scattered remains, plural, large enough to require multiple hands to lift clear of the trench, arranged closely enough to suggest they had not arrived there by accident. Engineers and inspectors were recorded on site that afternoon. Their presence was logged, their conclusions were not. What replaced them in the documentation was a familiar phrase, cleared for continuation. The ground had offered something up, and the record had already begun to smooth it back into silence. Once the first references surfaced, the next step was unavoidable. Numbers, not rumors, not adjectives, measurements. Several documents that escaped later consolidation included figures written in the same clipped style used for steel tolerances and cable tension, lengths recorded in feet rather than inches, notes about span rather than stature, phrases that made sense when applied to beams or stonework, and felt disorienting when attached to biological material. 8 feet 9. One entry hesitated, scratched over, then replaced with a cleaner hand. 10. What mattered was not the highest number, but the consistency between them. Independent logs, separate clerks, different days. The figures clustered instead of wandering. No wide scatter, no tentative approximations. the sort of repetition that usually signals routine measurement rather than astonishment. Contemporary anatomical tables from the period place extraordinary height far below that threshold, even for outliers. Medical literature from the late 19th century treated such dimensions as rare enough to warrant case studies, sketches, public lectures. Here, the handwriting remained procedural. There were no flourishes, no margin notes expressing disbelief, only recalculations, cross-checks, conversions between units, the quiet administrative work of people making sure what they had written could survive later scrutiny. Additional observers appear indirectly through the paper trail. Signatures added beneath figures. Initials repeated in separate columns. A widening circle of verification without any expansion of explanation. The effect was unsettling precisely because of its restraint. No one seemed eager to dramatize what they were handling. They were trying to make the numbers behave, and the numbers refused. Once the measurements were accounted for, the paper trail should have grown thicker. Instead, it thinned. I moved outward from the engineering logs into period newspapers, municipal circulars, city bulletins, publications that chronicled dock repairs, warehouse fires, minor accidents along the river. If anything unusual had happened beneath one of the largest infrastructure projects in the country, it should have echoed outward through that ecosystem of print. It did, briefly. A short notice in a local column referenced an interruption near the anchorage works, another mentioned material being removed under supervision. Neither lingered. Neither returned to the subject in subsequent issues. No serialized coverage, no editorial curiosity, just a sentence, then silence. City records behaved the same way. Ledger entries terminated mid-sequence. Filing numbers jumped. Index cards pointed toward folders that no longer existed. In a few cases, the cross-references were still there, dutifully directing the reader toward a destination that had been hollowed out. What remained were shadows of process. Permits issued without attachments, transit orders lacking cargo descriptions, inventory tallies that skipped over specific dates. Altogether, the administrative skeleton of something once documented in full. No signature suggested panic, no stamp declared classification, only absence. Institutions began to emerge, not through what they said, but through what they failed to preserve. Offices that normally archived everything, committees that produced minutes for even the most trivial deliberations. Here, their voices cut off at the same moment. The pattern did not resemble destruction. It resembled omission. And omission, repeated across departments and decades, has a way of becoming its own form of testimony. The Brooklyn files were not the only place where the trail thinned. Several secondary sources pointed toward a familiar destination, one invoked whenever unusual material surfaced during 19th century excavations. The remains, according to those accounts, were forwarded for professional evaluation, crated, catalogued, sent north, transferred into a system designed to preserve, not forget, and that assumption was easy to test. Shipment manifests from the period still exist in fragments. Receiving ledgers list fossils, tools, skeletal fragments from burial mounds across the Midwest and the South. Each entry is typically followed by accession, numbers, storage locations, internal correspondence. When I searched for anything that matched the Brooklyn descriptions, the pattern fractured. There were gaps where a delivery should have been logged, reference codes that appeared in outgoing paperwork but never surfaced again on the receiving end, letters acknowledging crates without detailing contents, forms completed in every respect except the one line reserved for classification. Procedurally, it made no sense. Institutions built around collecting artifacts are meticulous about chain of custody. Objects pass through layers of labeling, subdivision, duplication. Even mistakes leave trails. Here, the trail blurred just as authority entered the picture. The anomaly had migrated from a municipal excavation into national infrastructure, and with that shift came a different kind of silence. Not local disinterest, not frontier improvisation, administrative quiet, the kind produced when something moves upward rather than outward. What unsettled me was not the absence of a public exhibit. It was the absence of paperwork explaining why there wasn't one. In a system designed to document everything, the disappearance of documentation becomes its own data point. And once that possibility is acknowledged, it is difficult to stop noticing how often the same pattern repeats. Once the inquiry expanded beyond the riverbank, the Brooklyn case stopped looking singular. Other reports surfaced from the same decades, buried in regional papers and local bulletins that normally concern themselves with crop prices or courthouse renovations. Brief notices about unusual finds during railroad cuts, mounds opened for farmland that produced remains described as far larger than expected. Excavations halted, then resumed, with no public accounting of what had caused the interruption. What mattered was not where these discoveries occurred. It was when. The dates clustered tightly in the late 19th century, spanning states that shared little administratively and nothing geographically. River valleys in the Midwest, industrial corridors along the coast, newly surveyed territories in the interior, separate jurisdictions, separate institutions, similar silences. Regional museums appear only indirectly in these fragments through shipping orders and correspondence acknowledgments that lack descriptive detail. Survey teams are referenced by initials rather than names. Committees convened, adjourned, and left no published conclusions. The repetition was subtle but persistent. Local anomaly, brief documentation, transfer into institutional hands. Then disappearance. Taken individually, each case could be dismissed as clerical loss or provincial exaggeration. Placed side by side, they began to resemble something more deliberate in its shape, if not yet in its explanation. The Brooklyn discovery no longer stood alone in the archives. It had joined a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, tend to demand a different level of attention. At that point, the question was no longer whether records were missing, it was why they were missing. In the same way, I tested the simplest explanations first. Fires were common in 19th century cities. Paper decayed. Clerks made errors. Early scientific institutions lacked standardized procedures. Any one of those factors could account for a lost file or an incomplete ledger. None of them explained consistency. If destruction were random, the gaps would be uneven. If negligence were to blame, the omissions would scatter. Instead, the absences aligned across cities, across decades, across institutions that otherwise documented relentlessly. Records vanished at the moment they should have multiplied. Measurements appear, then stop. Transfers are noted, then never resolved. Committees convene, then leave no trace of conclusion. The machinery of bureaucracy engages just long enough to acknowledge an anomaly, then disengages entirely. Ordinary failure does not behave like that. What replaced it was something quieter, a narrowing of what remained accessible, a gradual thinning of narrative, until only officially comfortable explanations survived intact. The trail did not end in chaos. It ended in order, and that was what made it difficult to ignore. Once the measurements were laid out, the question shifted. Not where the bones came from, but what they would have forced into motion if they were accepted as accurate. A 15-foot human skeleton does not sit quietly inside existing models. It presses against migration timelines, against growth limits recorded in medical literature, against assumptions about what populations could have existed without leaving an unmistakable genetic legacy in the present. It does not invalidate anthropology outright, but it demands revisions so extensive that footnotes would no longer suffice. Entire categories would have required reclassification. Settlement histories would have needed recalculation. Nutritional environments reconsidered. Developmental constraints revisited. The absence of parallel discoveries in modern populations would become a central problem rather than a peripheral one. I kept circling back to the same procedural reality. finds a far smaller consequence had generated decades of peer review. This one, if real, should have produced libraries. Instead, it produced a thinning trail. The more I mapped what the evidence would have disrupted, the clearer the silence around it began to feel less neutral. Some discoveries expand knowledge. Others destabilize the scaffolding, holding it upright. Those are the ones institutions hesitate over. Those are the ones that pause careers, funding streams, reputations. And standing there, between numbers on a page and the frameworks meant to absorb them, the mystery widened, not because the data was dramatic, but because of what accepting it would obligate everyone to confront. Sometimes the weight of an absence is calculated not by what vanished, but by what could not comfortably survive if it remained. By the time I reached the present, the search no longer moved forward through new discoveries. It moved through what was missing. No skeletons on display, no accession numbers traceable through public catalogues, no follow-up studies buried in obscure journals, no technical monographs re-examining 19th century measurements, no contested debates preserved in correspondence between rival institutions, not even marginal references in modern compilations of anomalous archaeological finds. Absence accumulated. The Brooklyn records did not stand alone in that void. Other sites hinted at in earlier chapters shared the same terminal quiet. Initial notices, brief administrative handling, then nothing that could be followed into the contemporary archive. Silence does not announce itself. It has to be measured. I began treating it the same way the soil layers beneath the bridge had been treated, as a stratigraphic feature rather than a blank. When silence persists across decades, across departments, across reorganizations and digitization campaigns, it becomes less like neglect and more like a structural property of the system that produced it. The antagonism in this case never resolved into faces. It remained procedural. Filing systems that end mid-entry, collections that reference transfers without destinations, databases that acknowledge categories but contain no contents, public-facing narratives that glide past the subject without acknowledging that earlier writers ever paused there. What lingered was not outrage. It was unease, the kind produced when every road converges on the same quiet clearing. Evidence leads outward, counter-arguments leave trails, errors generate corrections. Only one thing repeats cleanly: nothing, and standing inside that nothing, surrounded by records designed to preserve rather than forget, I was left with the same unresolved pressure that had followed the investigation from its beginning. Not a conclusion, a boundary. The place where inquiry slows, not because questions have been answered, but because the systems built to hold answers have stopped speaking altogether. The investigation never reached a door marked closed. It reached ground that could no longer be opened. Once the Brooklyn records were exhausted, the questions began drifting outward, toward other bridges, tunnels, foundations, poured into 19th century riverbeds, toward projects whose documentation looked complete until examined closely. How many excavations ended with brief notices and no surviving follow-up? How many early discoveries were recorded just long enough to be forgotten? How many measurements were taken seriously for a season and then dissolved into administrative silence? I tried to catalogue those unknowns. They resisted cataloguing. The map that formed was not geographic. It was procedural. Wherever early infrastructure met deep earth, the paper trail grew thin at exactly the moment physical evidence should have thickened. Wherever claims exceeded comfortable limits, the archival records seemed to flatten. No answers arrived to replace the gaps, only more territory beneath them. If something had once been uncovered under Brooklyn, the lasting question was no longer what it was. It was how many similar moments had passed without leaving enough behind for anyone to reconstruct them now. The ground keeps its own memory. Institutions decide which parts of that memory remain accessible. Between those two forces, entire stories can vanish without needing to be disproved at all.